Okay, so let's give this a go to cover Kant and his deontological ethics, okay? So we're looking again at Barbara McKinnon and Andrew Fiala's textbook on ethics, where we're looking at chapter 6, having to do with deontological ethics and Immanuel Kant. So the chapter opens with the notion of autonomy, so the belief that persons are autonomous, yet we need to be extremely careful with our understanding of autonomy and how we regard it with respect to individual rights and the ways in which we as individuals regard ourselves as inextricably linked rationally to the larger whole, as a regard for ethics in general is never simply about isolated individuals. Okay, so Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg, Prussia in 1724. He died in 1804. So that's actually modern day Russia, but it's what we generally know of as Germany. So he's a German philosopher, German Enlightenment thinker, and we look to him for his work on epistemology as well as normative ethics, more specifically deontology. Okay, so deontology is basically another way of identifying Kant's moral theory. So basically, deontology is what is meant as a theory of duty. Okay, so in other words, deontology basically means theory of duty. Deontology is non-consequential, with a focus on things we ought to do, what we have a duty to do, regardless of consequences. So, i.e., rational and practical, ethical things we do regardless of consequences, okay? So on page 116 of our textbook, McKinnon and Fiala write about the Euthyphro dilemma, interestingly enough, of Plato and Socrates to be contrasted with divine command theory. So, in other words, whereby we find the paradox as follows. McKinnon and Fiala don't completely isolated, but this is the Euthyphro problem, or the paradox of Euthyphro. Quote, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Unquote. So it's then really just transferred to a divine command perspective, whereby we're thinking that is the good commanded by God because it's good, or is the good good because God commands it? Okay, so in other words, let's ask that question again. Is good commanded by God because it's good? Question mark, right? We don't have any way of knowing that. Or is the good good because God commands it? So in other words, we're looking at what goodness means here and how to direct ourselves toward it, but we're left with this paradox whereby we have no definition of what's good, only that God considers it good, etc., right? Or that God commands it, therefore it's good. So we have this circularity whereby there's no real way, there's no authentic, rational way in which to understand what goodness is here. So there's an impasse that we meet when we're considering divine command theory, which is in contrast to how we're understanding Kantian ethics. So such a paradox is a direct critique of the good as it's regarded by God, right? So this is problematic due to the idea that if the good is good because God commands it, this puts the original value of the good solely in the command and not in the value of the good in and of itself, right? So, or is the good, like we were looking at, is the good commanded by God because it's good? And in this case, still, it does not reveal why the good is good to begin with, right? It's circular reasoning. So in its own right, rationally, we see that the paradox exposes the arbitrary nature of the way in which we know the good as commanded by God. And so this is not wholly knowable, nor can we find a justification for our valuing of the good. So remember that the Euthyphro dilemma was written in the context of the dialogue titled Euthyphro by Plato, and the dialogue was with Socrates and Euthyphro. Okay, so in other words, this is showing you not only a contrast to religious thinking and a contrast to deontological ethics, but also a way in which we're understanding rational cognition as well, or reasoning out how we understand the good, okay? So this is not wholly connected with Kant other than it is rational, and it's a way, it is a way to rationally understand a problem with the way in which we understand divine command theory, and hence to understand that Kant's deontological ethics, and likewise Plato, they are not divine command theorists. Okay, so Kant isn't, nor was Plato. They were both, or they were all three really, Plato, Socrates, and Kant, rationalists. Okay, so then at this point, we are left with the paradox, thinking that if we don't know the original basis for valuing the good as it rests in the hands of the gods, then we are left at a stalemate. Yet yet the easy way out, oddly enough, is by our own reasoning. In other words, that is to say, we, all of us, still can inquire about the good in the way we see, in the way in which we understand goodness ourselves. Okay, so this is really important because it's getting us to a way in which we're understanding things rationally for ourselves, okay, as autonomous individuals within a community of people within an environment, right? So the Danish philosopher and Christian Søren Kierkegaard would disagree with this in that to have faith is a question of faith that is really beyond reason, right? So faith has to do with taking faith in something that is essentially unknown, and what is wholly unknowable is not only God, but also our subjective and personal relationship, understood existentially for ourselves individually, personally, experientially, okay? So this is in contrast again to Immanuel Kant. So we'll put McKinnon and Fiala's analysis of Stoicism off to the side, only to acknowledge linkage from a Stoical choice, as it's known to us rationally, as a parallel to Kant's strong recognition of autonomy as well, okay? So better said, rational autonomy is understood as duty for the Stoic, and is always a rational recognition of one's duty as it's measured by the rational order of things in our community, our obligations to others, nature, etc. So for Kant, though, this isn't quite enough here to suggest that we have a rational duty to the logos of nature, obviously, and so he doesn't just leave it there, as the Stoics do. So this is certainly true, yet it's too general and not specific as to a non-consequential practice for Kant, right? So with Kant, we have the question, what gives an act moral worth, as McKinnon and Fiala have it, right? So while not resting on just consequences as the utilitarians do. So to lead us to an answer for what gives us what gives an act moral worth, we'll start by emphasizing the essential basis of the goodwill in and of itself for Kant. If our aim is always goodness, our willpower, our practice, our actions need to be directed with a good willingness from the get-go as our duty, okay? So, and it's an unconditional duty. Goodwill for its own sake is truly ethical as much as it's our duty to will our acts as aiming toward goodness. Okay, so still we are taken to the question, how do we know what's good by way of Kant's deontology, right? So how do we know what's good by way of Kant's deontology? That's where we'll hear of the famous categorical imperative. So categorical here applies in all cases. The word categorical means that it applies in all cases without question. So an imperative has to do with a guideline or an action. In this case, it's a guideline toward a duty to always carry out an act that is universally good, right? So we have a hypothetical imperative whereby the imperative is not categorical. So a hypothetical imperative is not something to be universally followed, right? So in other words, as McKinnon and Fiala isolated, quote, if or because I want to do X, then I ought to do Y, unquote. So that's really a rough definition of how it is that we understand a hypothetical imperative. So a categorical imperative is something I have a duty and an ought to do, that I should do, right? Unconditionally, regardless of the outcome. So is this universally applicable? So far as we know, it must aim, is this action universally applicable? I would ask myself, so far we know we must aim toward the good by way of our will. Likewise, this aim is our duty and a way to direct our practice toward ethical lives. And Kant's categorical imperative serves as a guideline toward a principle of goodness, right? So in other words, how do we know if we are dutifully aimed for the good, right? If we are able to, quote, and this is the first version of the categorical imperative, to only act on that maxim that you can will as a universal law. So this is the first version of the categorical imperative. So in other words, to act only on that maxim that you can will to be a universal law, unquote, is the first version of the categorical imperative. So as McKinnon and Fiala point out, quote, as a rational being, by way of the categorical imperative, I will what is non-contradictory, unquote. So I will that my act match whatever it is to be universal in whatever I'm aiming to do. And if that contradicts with universal applicability, then I should not act, right? So then there's the second version of the categorical imperative, which is always, quote, always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time an end, unquote. So, in other words, other people are wanting their own ends and should not be put to the use of my own ends, right? Likewise, I should not be I should not consent to be used as a means for someone else. In other words, I have a duty to be respectful to others as well as to myself, okay? So we have an ethical duty to ourselves as well. And often when we first hear either iteration of Kant's categorical imperative, we are inclined to assume that these are simply reorderings of the the golden rule, right? That they're, as a matter of fact, we simultaneously make the assumption that the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have others do unto you, is a moral guideline for all our moral behavior, right? So, in other words, just follow the golden rule, or Kant's categorical imperative is just another way of implying the golden rule, might be our assumption, okay? But yet, Kant draws a sharp distinction on page 121 in the excerpt from his groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals from 1785, where he writes that, he explains that the golden rule cannot be, quote, cannot be a universal law, for it does not contain the principle of duties to oneself, nor of duties to benevolence to others. For many a one would gladly consent to others should not gladly consent that others should not benefit him, provided only that he might be excused from showing benevolence to them. Nor finally that of duties for strict obligation to one another, for on this principle the criminal might argue against the judge who punishes him, and so on, unquote. Okay, so that's Kant contrasting the categorical imperative to the golden rule, right? So with the golden rule, we do not have a duty to ourselves, according to Kant, in that we are only appealing to to what we or what we would or wouldn't like others to do to us. So, in other words, with the golden rule, we do not have a duty to ourselves in that we are only appealing to that to what we would or wouldn't like others to do to us, okay? So, likewise, and our treatment of others, likewise, and in our treatment of others, according to the golden rule, is only contingent on how we want to be treated. In other words, if I treat you badly, I'm not worried if you treat me badly. That's an excuse for treating you badly, right? If I'm fine treating you badly, so therefore I would be all right if you treated me badly, etc. So likewise, we might find under the golden rule that we might have an unusually high expectation as to how I want to be treated, right? And others can't meet that high expectations. So in other words, the golden rule is too subjective, right? So given that it relies on how I want to be treated, how I want to be treated is not universally applicable, right? So in other words, whereby if I ask myself, am I willing to act on that maxim which is to be willed to be a universal law, the decision is pulled out of this subjectivity of the golden rule to something that looks like a rational way in which we're understanding our ethical behavior that could be measured per situation, per specific context, in order to put practice to our autonomy by way of rational agency. Okay, so why don't we call it a close there, take it from there, and thank you.